The prairie stretched wide beneath the fading afternoon sun, its golden grass swaying with the gentle hum of the wind, and the endless horizon painted with hues of amber and violet as dusk began to roll in, and right in the middle of that lonely expanse stood a broken-down wagon leaning, awkwardly on one splintered wheel, its wooden frame worn from long miles and the heavy weight of a life, lived in struggle and hope, and beside it was a woman whose hands were stained with dirt and determination, sleeves rolled up to her elbows, hair falling loose in stray strands across her flushed cheeks as she braced herself against the stubborn wheel axle, trying with all her might to force it into place, her breath coming sharp and uneven, though her spirit never faltered. For she was a woman who had known hardship and still rose each day to fight against it. Yet no matter how fiercely she pushed, no matter how her fingers ached from gripping the tools, the stubborn wagon refused to give way, and in that moment of weariness she leaned against the wooden side, head bowed, a small sigh of defeat escaping her lips, unaware that just beyond the rise of the hill, a lone rider had been watching, his figure tall in the saddle outlined by the fading sun, a man with shoulders broad beneath a dusted shirt, a brown hat pulled low to shade his steady eyes, and a presence that seemed carved from the very land itself, strong, quiet, enduring, a cowboy who had spent his life among the wild plains and yet whose heart stirred, unexpectedly at the sight of this woman, wrestling against something she should not have had to bear alone, and he nudged his horse forward, the leather creaking beneath him, the sound of hooves soft against the dirt until he was close enough that his shadow stretched across her, and she lifted her head in surprise, startled at first by the figure before her, but something in his eyes held no threat, only concern, and then he spoke in a low voice that carried both strength and gentleness, the kind of voice that made her heart pause for a fraction of a second. "You shouldn't be doing that alone," he said, his tone firm but not condescending, protective but not possessive, as though he knew the weight of her independence, yet also understood the danger of letting her carry every burden without a hand to steady her, and for a heartbeat she didn't know whether to be offended at the intrusion or grateful for the kindness. But his gaze held hers, steady, unyielding, until she found herself replying, breathless and tired, "And who else do you see around here to help me?" Her voice carried both defiance and exhaustion, because she had been left alone. So many times she no longer knew what it was like to lean on another soul, but something in the way he dismounted, tying his reins loosely to the wagon before stepping closer, his boots crunching softly against the dry earth, told her that he wasn't going to walk away like the others had, and he reached for the wheel without asking again, his calloused hands gripping the frame, with a strength that made the stubborn wagon shift at last, the wood groaning in protest until it finally fell back into place, and the sight of it, fixed within moments by the power of his will and his hands, made something stir inside her chest, a realization of just how long she had been fighting alone, and she swallowed hard, unsure what words to say. But he glanced at her then, sweat glistening against his brow, a small half-smile curling at the corner of his mouth, not smug but quietly reassuring, as if to say he wasn't there to take her fight away, only to share it, and the silence between them grew thick with unspoken thoughts, the kind of silence that feels alive, like a thread being spun between two souls who had not meant to cross paths, yet somehow did, and she found herself asking, "Why would you stop for me?" Most men ride past without even looking back, and he shrugged in that simple, understated way of men who don't think their goodness needs explaining. "Because no one should have to stand in the middle of the prairie at sundown and fight the world by themselves," he answered, and her heart stilled for a moment at the weight of his words, for it had been so long since anyone had spoken to her like that, with truth and care wrapped together, and as the sun sank lower, painting his rugged features in shades of fire and shadow, she realized that maybe this cowboy was more than just a passerby. Maybe he was a reminder that strength wasn't only in doing everything on her own, but sometimes in letting someone else walk beside her, and though she wanted to guard her heart, to push him away as she had done with others, something in his steady presence disarmed her, left her defenses faltering, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed a sliver of hope to flicker quietly inside her chest, hope that maybe the road ahead wouldn't have to be walked in silence anymore. And as she glanced at him again, his eyes holding that quiet promise of protection, she whispered softly, almost to herself, "Maybe I don't have to," and he nodded once, as though he had heard her heart speak louder than her lips. And in that moment, under the vast sky and the fading glow of twilight, Something unshakable was planted between them, the beginning of a story neither of them had expected, yet both were powerless to resist. And if you felt the pull of this tale, dear listener, if your heart has leaned into the strength of this cowboy and the courage of this woman, then I invite you to stay with us. To subscribe to this channel, because more chapters are waiting, stories that will grip your heart, stir your soul, and remind you that even in the loneliest places, love and hope can ride in like a cowboy. At sunset, the night air settled heavy over the plains as the last of the sun gave way to silver starlight, and the woman found herself still standing beside the wagon, though now it no longer leaned precariously, no longer mocked her with its stubborn weight, for the cowboy's hands had steadied it. His strength had restored what her determination alone could not, and though the task was done, something in her lingered, caught in the quiet presence of the stranger who had not passed her by, and she felt the weight of silence stretch between them like the endless prairie itself, vast, uncertain, and yet filled with possibility. And she wondered if he would leave now that his good deed was finished, ride off into the night like so many men before, leaving nothing but dust in his wake. But instead he leaned casually against the wagon, adjusting his hat with that easy, unhurried motion that belonged to men who carried time like it was theirs to control, his gaze steady on her, not in a way that made her shrink back, but in a way that made her wonder if he could see deeper than she meant anyone to see. And at last she broke the silence, her voice softer now, no longer sharp with weariness. "You've done what you came to do. You don't owe me anything more." And he tilted his head slightly, his jaw tightening as if her words struck something in him. And then he said low and firm, "Ma'am, I don't ride off and leave someone in the dark when there's still danger around. And whether you see it or not, there's plenty of danger out here once the sun drops behind those hills." And she wanted to argue, wanted to tell him she had survived alone long enough to know how to handle herself. But the truth hung in her heart heavier than her pride. She was tired, bone-deep tired, of carrying everything on her shoulders. And though her lips formed no answer, he seemed to read the battle in her eyes. So he stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You've been doing it all by yourself for too long, haven't you?" And the question pierced straight through her defenses, because it wasn't just about the wagon. It was about everything. The nights she had sat by a fire with no one beside her, the mornings she had risen to face the world without a hand to help, the choices she had made out of necessity rather than hope. And though she wanted to deny it, to keep her walls high and unyielding, her throat tightened, betraying her, and she turned away quickly, blinking hard at the horizon where the last of the orange faded into night, whispering, "What choice do I have?" And he didn't answer right away, just let the silence stretch again. But this time it wasn't empty, it was full, alive, carrying the weight of something unsaid, until at last he stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the steady warmth of his presence, without him needing to touch her. And he said softer now, "You've got a choice right now. You can keep fighting alone, or you can let someone ride beside you for a while." And the words hit her harder than she expected, because they weren't laced with pity. They weren't offered like a man trying to swoop in and take over her life. They were a simple truth, an invitation, one she hadn't realized she had been waiting for. And she swallowed, torn between fear and longing, between the habit of self-reliance and the quiet ache for connection. And finally she asked, voice trembling just enough to betray the storm inside her, "And if I let you ride beside me, how long before you decide it's not worth it? How long before you ride away like the rest?" And for the first time something flickered in his eyes, something raw and unguarded, and he said, "I'm not the kind that rides away once I give my word." And she wanted to believe him, wanted so badly to lean into the promise in those words, but her heart was scarred, and scars don't fade easily. Yet the steady way he held her gaze made her wonder if maybe, just maybe, there were men who meant what they said. And before she could find the courage to answer, the wind picked up, rustling the tall grass, and the cry of a coyote echoed faintly across the distance, reminding her of the loneliness and danger of these wild lands, and she shivered slightly. Though whether from the cold or from the closeness of the cowboy, she couldn't tell, and without another word, he moved to his horse, pulling a blanket from the saddle and draping it gently across her shoulders. The gesture so simple yet so deeply human that her throat tightened again, because no one had thought to do such a thing for her in so long, and she pulled the fabric closer, whispering, "Why are you doing this?" And he looked at her, his eyes steady beneath the brim of his hat, and said, "Because strength doesn't mean carrying the world until it breaks you. It means knowing when to let someone else carry part of it with you. And in that moment, under the endless expanse of stars, something shifted inside her. Not a sudden crumbling of walls, but the first crack of light breaking through, the first flicker of trust daring to be born. And as they stood together in the quiet night, the wagon fixed, the prairie alive with whispers of wind and shadow, she realized that perhaps the road ahead would not be walked alone after all. And though fear still lingered, though doubt still tugged at her, hope began to take root where despair had once grown. And if you've journeyed this far into their story, if you feel the stirring of that same hope, then stay with us, because this is only the beginning, and more lies ahead for them both. So don't forget to subscribe to this channel, because every chapter brings you closer to the heart of a tale that will remind you of courage, resilience, and the kind of love that can change everything.